This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 186 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for today is Rick Yell. Rick served as a civilian agent with the Naval Investigative Service, later renamed the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. In 1986, he was assigned to the resident agency at Fort Amador, Panama. He was present, along with his family, before, during, and after Operation Just Cause, when the U.S. military ousted Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. Rick is featured as one of the primary subjects of the new book, Ghosts of Panama, by Mark Harmon and Leon Carroll Jr., which is available now. I invited Rick onto the podcast to discuss his time in Panama as relations with the United States deteriorated and both nations prepared for war, and what it is like to live through a chaotic invasion right in your own backyard. But before we get into Rick's story, I want to tell you all about OC Strategic Academy. OC Strategic Academy is here to teach you how to transform your career with the skills of a spy. With OC Strategic Academy, you can learn to understand people on a deeper level, influence decisions and build connections, and gain the edge you've been missing in work, in life, and in every interaction. Each course has been developed by a former war reporter turned human intelligence collector with extensive experience in the Middle East. The courses include Negotiate Like a Spy and Network Like a Spy, plus several others. There is also private, one-on-one coaching available if you're interested in training that is tailored directly to your needs. You can find them at academy.ocstrategic.com and use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 to get 10% off any course you decide is right for you. Click the link in the show notes of this episode to level up your human intelligence skills. Rick, thank you for being here today.
Glad to be here.
I really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to this for a while now. Can you tell me how you learned that your story, your personal story, was going to be at the center of a new book?
Yeah, I was an agent with NCIS, formerly NIS, for almost 25 years. And Leon Carroll Jr., the technical advisor to the NCIS television shows, he was also a special agent during my tenure. About 5 years ago, Chuck Bryant, my supervisor, the special agent in charge when I was in Panama, contacted me and asked me if I would write a story for the retired NCIS Agents magazine. And I hesitated at first because I had put Panama behind me. My wife and I didn't talk about it much. But he asked me, he said, I really want you to write this story. I said, why? He said, you're the only agent, to my knowledge, that has operated in a war zone and had to care for a family also. So he finally coached me into writing an article, and he looked at it. It was sent to the publisher, and the publisher looked at it, and he realized Leon Carroll had been in Panama right after the invasion, so he forwarded the copy out to Leon. Leon, in turn, called Chuck Bryant and asked, did he know that I had written an article? Chuck said, yes, and I'm the one that asked him to write it. So that was 5 years ago. And it was just quiet. I never heard from Leon. And it was in about May of 2023, I get a call from Leon Carroll. And he told me that he and Mark Harmon were not actively doing the television show at that point. And they had always known that the television show got away from telling the real stories about real cases of the NCIS. Mark basically had to become educated about what we did and what our mission was after he agreed to do the television show. So he said that they kind of got into the murder of the week kind of scenario because they had these actors and they had to have a job for them. And they drifted away from telling real stories or episodes based upon real stories. So once they were not doing the acting thing on the television show, they said that they had always, over the 19 years that they worked together, vowed that one day they would tell real stories about real NCIS agents. So Leon, having been in Panama and then knowing that I wrote that article, he called and said, hey, we're thinking about doing a book about you and your wife. he got the wheels in motion, and we started doing interviews. He interviewed myself and my wife and all of the agents who were assigned there in Panama at the time. And it's been a labor of about 18 months before the book finally was released last November. So the book is based upon the memories and recollections of the actual special agents who were assigned to Panama during the period of just cause and what their actions were.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was very glad that I stumbled across the book just browsing in Barnes and Noble like I tend to do pretty often. And now here we are. And that's honestly incredible that your family was there with you as, these large scale combat operations began. That's a really, really just incredibly tense part of the book. And I know we'll get into that in a little while here. But I want to go all the way back to the beginning of your story. Rick, can you tell me why you joined NIS to begin with, and as a civilian, right? Not as a enlisted sailor or anything.
I went to a Southern college, Jacksonville State University in Alabama, and I got a bachelor's and a master's degree from Jacksonville. Right in my last semester of graduate school, I went to a social event, and in walks about 5 college girls. And right in the middle of the college girls was a beautiful, beautiful woman. So I walked right up to her and I said, I got to get to know you. And it was Anya, the lady that eventually became my wife. And we basically, I was in grad school and she was a freshman. So we ended up dating about 3.5 years before we got married. So by the time she graduated from Jacksonville, I was already a special agent assigned to the Millington office north of Memphis, Tennessee. I went to, the reason that I applied with NIS is I was looking for a federal job. Law enforcement pay in Alabama at that particular time was pretty low. I think I was a police officer and made like $10,000 a year. And that was it's poverty level. So I had the education and I was working on the experience. And when I found out from a young lady in Jacksonville that had just recently been hired by NIS, I said, I'm going to apply with them also. So I met a special agent in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he did the initial interview, the pre-screen, and then I was recommended for a screening board at Naval Air Station Memphis. And from there, several months later, I was offered a job. I was told that the special agent in charge at Memphis, requested that I be assigned to him at that office. So that was fine with me because it was just a couple of 100 miles from the place that I had grown up and my farm in Tennessee. So I started as a special agent there assigned to Naval Air Station Memphis.
Okay, I guess I didn't know that there was a Naval Air Station in Memphis at the time, but I just assumed you'd be on the coast or the Great Lakes or overseas or something like that. But can you tell me a little bit about the normal duties for you? Because you were primarily a criminal investigator, right? Not like a counterintelligence agent or something like that?
Yeah, interesting that you said that about not knowing about Memphis. When I was assigned there, I was told that NAS Memphis was the largest inland naval base in the world. And what it was, the Naval Air Technical Training Center was there, and they had all of these kids, any enlisted kid that had anything to do with naval aviation at some point was trained at NAS Memphis. So we had, I want to say there were 10 to 12,000 sailors and Marines there that were attending their A schools and learning how to do what their specialty would be in the Navy and the Marine Corps. So when you've got that many hormones and that many young men and women there's going to be a lot of criminal activity. Probably 97% of these military kids that went through there, you never heard of them. You didn't know their name because they never got into trouble. But there was about 3% that would keep you busy. There were a lot of rapes. There were a lot of thefts, forgeries, assaults. So it was a great place for a guy with a criminal background to learn how to do crime scenes, to learn how to do interviews and interrogations, and to recruit sources because there were some narcotics on the base. So we would recruit sources to make controlled purchases of narcotics. it was just a really good place to cut your teeth and to learn how to do an investigation.
Okay, yeah, that sounds very, very interesting. Did you go to Panama after Memphis, or did you have some other stops along the way in your career?
I was there for about 2 years, and one morning I was sitting in my office writing up a report, and my special agent in charge, Dave Swindle, walks in, and he said, "Oh, good, you're sitting down," and that never is good. And he said, "Debbie is typing your orders right now." He said, "Go home and collect your gear and be at this hotel in Alexandria, Virginia tonight, and be prepared to be gone for 2 months."
Oh my gosh.
And I said, "Why?" He said, "They'll tell you when you get there." So that night, myself and about 75 other special agents were sitting at the hotel, had no idea why we were there. And the next morning, they placed us out on protection details on key Department of Defense personnel. And we were protecting these dignitaries, but we had no idea why. And then about a day after that, we bombed Libya. That's when we launched an aerial attack on Muammar Gaddafi. So what we later learned was that there was allegedly Libyan hit squads in the States that was going to take out these military leaders in the event that we attacked Libya. So I was up there. I probably spent a month or a month and a half up there. I came back to my room one night, and that little red light was flashing on the telephone, the little message light. And I picked it up, and the message said, "You need to call your boss in Memphis regardless of the hour." All right, well, that's not good. So I called him and woke him up, and I said, "I'm either in trouble or I'm getting transferred." And he laughed, and he said, "Well, buddy, you're not in trouble." And I said, "Okay, where?" And he said, "It's either Guam or Panama." And I said, "Dave, what would you do?" And he laughed, and he said, "Panama's not an island." And I said, "Yeah, that's what I was thinking." So they actually gave me a choice, and I chose Panama. So because I was getting transferred, they released me from that operation in Washington, and I returned to Memphis. My wife, Anya, she had to get a passport quickly, and we had to pack our household goods and hurry off on a summer transfer to Panama. It took a while to get her passport, so I actually went to Panama for the first 2 weeks without her. I went down by myself. When I arrived in Panama, or on the plane down, I thumbed through a Newsweek magazine and read that the United States had just accused Manuel Noriega of being an international narcotics trafficker. So, realizing that I would have to work a lot with the Panamanian government, I thought, well, this is not going to help things any. So, from literally from the time that I got off the plane, things started going downhill. I had to work investigations with the Panamanian investigators. They were called the DENI, Department of National Investigations. So we would try to establish friendships and relationships and just ignore what was happening, what the politics were. And it worked fairly well. I mean, I had a good rapport with some of those guys, and we were able to be professional with each other, even though things were like deteriorating politically.
Okay, I see. Can you tell me a little bit about, and tell the listeners as well, a little bit about the Panama Canal Zone? Because as I understand, it was just a strip a few miles wide that was ours there, and it was pretty contentious right from the start, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, but the Panama Canal Zone was a term that had gone away by the time I arrived, because they had taken down the fences and what have you, and Panamanians could come and go from what used to be the Canal Zone without having to show any identification. Oh, wow. And see, it to me it was like a colony. You had a lot of Americans down there that were working for the Panama Canal Company, later the Commission, and they really had a great life. But one of the agents that's mentioned in the book, Ted Fahey, he was my partner later on. He told me he grew up down there, went to high school down there, and he told me one time that the schools didn't even desegregate until like 1977.
Oh my gosh!
Which I just looked at him. I said, "You're kidding." And I said, "Our schools desegregated in the early 60s. He said, "Yeah." He said, "It was just different down here."
Mm-hmm.
But the canal zone would have been a beautiful place to live, and it would have been a beautiful place to grow up. But I always thought, I said, well, I didn't really think that the Panamanian people were being treated fairly, when there was a canal zone.
Okay, I see. Essentially, yeah, I never had the opportunity to visit, but the stories I've heard from people, it was all positive. Everybody loved it. Everybody had very good memories of it and wanted to go back if it was ever possible.
Yeah, yeah.
So were things kind of cordial, at least? I mean, it was clearly kind of the writing was on the wall, as we know now, when you first arrived. But I mean, how were relations like face to face with your Panamanian counterparts there?
Well, it depended on the individual. You get some of the Panamanian investigators that were very nationalistic, and they really didn't want to work with you that much. But that's not all of them. Some of them, of those guys were very agreeable to work with you. And it was always easy for me because the Army in Panama, that they were the largest service component. So the CID office that was there, they would come over and tell the Panamanian investigators, you're going to do it our way. This is the way we do things, and you're going to do it our way. Well, it didn't take long for me because I was the criminal investigator in a two-man office. I was the sole criminal investigator for Central and South America.
Wow.
So I knew that I was the Lone Ranger. So I went in there with my hat in my hand and said, yep, it's your country and we're going to do things according to your rules. I just need some help. And because of that attitude that I was respectful to them and everything, it really helped facilitate the work that I was able to get done.
Okay, I see. So this newspaper headline came out that you mentioned, but did that also mean that like the relationship between the two governments was deteriorating? Like were things changing? Were rules changing or anything like as time went by during your tour?
Yeah, it was. And the people, a lot of the Panamanian citizens had turned against Noriega and the PDF. In fact, the University of Panama, there were always demonstrations out in town. And these demonstrations got very violent. Noriega had a military group known as the Dobermans, and they had these big armored looking trucks that had water cannons on them. And they would go break up the demonstrations with these water cannons, and they had troops that had rubber hoses. They would beat these people with rubber hoses. So all the while that I'm trying to work Navy cases and be a criminal investigator out in town, you would have these warnings that, stay away from this area because there's a demonstration there. And we could see how brutal the PDF was becoming. And it was like when I got there in 1986 for myself and my wife was better than 1987. And 87 was better than 88. It was just a downhill. You could tell that things were getting worse and worse.
Okay, I've got you. So I know we'll talk about the family situation. Just some wild stuff happened there later on. But I know, as you've mentioned, you were a criminal investigator. But while you were down there, you wound up with this incredible human intelligence source, right? Which was a kind of a key to this whole story. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, like I said, when I went down there, it was a Sleepy Hollow. It was a two-man office for NIS. And I was the assistant special agent in charge, and the other guy was the special agent in charge. So my mission was to handle all of the crim matters, and he handled all of the foreign counterintelligence work. But we would help each other when we had to. But it was always during my era. I don't know how NCIS is now, but everybody was expected to have assets or informants. Assets, informants, sources, whatever you call them. You needed the eyes and ears on the street to help you make your own cases so that you could be proactive rather than reactive. So I set about to find sources. When I got down there, the previous guy didn't leave any registered sources on the books. So I knew that I had to go recruit them on my own. So I found a couple of guys in the Rodman Security Department that they were ex-Army guys and they had married local women and they lived on the economy. So I got associated with those guys and were using them to spot and assess other individuals that kind of had their finger on the pulse of what was happening down there criminally. narcotics trafficking on the Panama Canal was always huge. We knew that there was a lot of drugs that transited the canal. And I said, well, if I could get a source that could lead me to another guy and lead me to another guy to finally where I've got a really good asset, and I think that would be my game plan. So they sent me to an individual that worked for the Panama Canal Commission. He said he's ex-Army too, and he knows everybody in the old canal zone. So I went over and I got acquainted with him, and I told him that this is my mission. This is what I'm trying to do. I said, "Can you help me?" Well, he called back about a week later. He said, "I've got a guy that might be what you're looking for." So I went and I met, and that was my first meeting with this individual that became my trusted source. And the best way I can describe it, it was like the meeting was like when two male dogs first encounter each other, and you know how they're circling each other and they're kind of bristled up and they're unsure about what the other one is like. He looked at me and he was unsure of me because I was a gringo. He was a Panamanian. And we just started talking. And then we met several times after that. And then finally I could page him or he could page me and I would meet him at a location. And we just got to know each other. Once we established that relationship, I asked him about narcotics trafficking on the canal because I knew that he had a really good working knowledge of all of the people that worked there. So that's how the relationship started. I was a criminal guy. I felt for the people of Panama that they were having this problem with Noriega, but I was down there to do a job. So one day I met with him and he told me, he said, "I've got to go." He said, I can't stay today. And just out of curiosity, I said, "Where do you have to go?" And he said, "I got to go to the Comandancia." Well, that piqued my interest because I knew that the Comandancia was Noriega's headquarters. So I said, "Why do you have to go to the Comandancia?" And he told me that he had seen a relative. And I said, "Who's the relative?" And he told me, and it really got me interested. And I said, "So you can just walk in the Comandancia and go in any room?" He said, "No one questions me."
Wow.
Because he had that familiarity with so many of the players down there. So I thought, this guy could be a gold mine. So it still wasn't my job to focus on Noriega and his officers. But in a couple of weeks, he told me during a meet, he said, "Something's going on in your tank farm." And what he meant, that the Arahan tank farm was a couple of miles down the road from the Rodman Naval Station. And if memory serves me, there was like 23 subterranean tanks, and they held like 1.2 million gallons of fuel. So all in all, not an exciting place, a very boring place, until he tells me that we've got Panamanians infiltrating at night. And the reason they're going in there is they're practicing if they ever have to blow those tanks.
Wow.
That they want to be experienced. They want to have a game plan. And then he told me something that kind of really set me back. He said, "They're all not Panamanian." And I said, "Well, who are they?" And he said, "I saw a guy leaving the Comandancia and said he was trying to hail a taxi, but he asked for a coche." And I didn't understand the significance with my very limited Spanish. And I said, "Well, what's the significance of that?" He said, "Panamanians don't call them coches." He said, "Cubans call them coaches." I said, "You think that he's got Cuban troops working with the Panamanians?" He said, "That's the way it appears." So I went back to the office and I knew I had to report this. So I got a report out, and believe me, it captured a lot of attention. Within a couple of weeks, there were ships pulling up to the Rodman Pier, and they were unloading Marines with light armored vehicles. And they didn't have a place to billet these Marines, so they put them out on the softball fields that's right beside the canal in tents. So they brought a lot of Marines in. And then they started doing patrols in the tank farm at night. And it wasn't long until they started encountering individuals in that tank farm that should not have been there. And there were some really big firefights, machine guns and mortars and flares going on in the tank farm at night. So it appeared that his reporting was right on track. So that was really, I mean, that was what made me start focusing more on Noriega, because he was sending troops into our facility for the purpose of infiltrating and possibly sabotaging naval facilities. So, I mean, all along I had seen all of the protests at the university, but that was a Panamanian problem. It didn't concern me, other than making sure that U.S. personnel were safe and they steered clear of the area. But when he's sending troops in there in the hours of darkness and planning or plotting to do sabotage, that's exactly what I'm supposed to be reporting on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how my criminal asset turned into an intelligence asset.
Yeah, that's incredibly good timing and hard work on your part, diligence to kind of find your way through multiple cutouts to exactly the right person at exactly the right time. So that worked out really well. I was totally stunned reading the book when you talked about, well, when the authors, Carol and Harmon, talked about the battles going on at the tank farm. I mean, Marines are taking mortar fire and we're not in a, declared combat. I don't know if that made the news at the time, but it was brand new to me, like a long time before Just Cause actually kicked off.
Yeah, this was in 1988. Just Cause didn't happen until December 20th, 1989. Yeah. So it was. I was very fortunate that I had the old man, that he was able to provide this type of information, because I don't think it had been going on for that long when we were able to get the information. But I remember walking out on my sidewalk one evening, getting a call from the Rodman Security Department that there was a firefight in progress at the tank farm. And when I walked out, it sounded like, a war. You could hear machine gun fire, and you see flares. And the Marine barracks CO, I heard him on the radio asking for helos to come in and drop more ammunition to his Marines, that they were already getting low on ammo.
Oh my gosh.
So, and then we had a Marine killed out there. During one of the firefights, I was notified that a Marine corporal had been fatally shot. So the next day, I went out to the tank farm to where it took place. And it was just me. I was out there by myself. And what I was doing, I was looking for evidence to try to piece together what happened. I asked the Army for some minesweeping equipment so that any metallic object that may be down in that high jungle grass, that I could recover it, so I could know how I could explain how this happened and how this young man lost his life. I also seized all of the weapons of the Marines that were involved and had fired rounds. We were able to determine that the Marine was actually killed by friendly fire.
Oh, no.
Through the examination of the weapons and the bullets recovered from the victim. But there was still a presence. There were still troops in there. And one night, during one firefight, there were buses that stopping out on the Panamanian highway and picking up people, and they were loading onto the bus. This was right outside the tank farm. So the Panamanians were there asking for a ceasefire, yet denying that they had any people inside the tank farm. So, and that was 88. So you might say that the future for this asset, myself, was kind of forged like a year or so before Just Cause.
Wow. Okay. I see. So by the time of these firefights in the tank farm that you mentioned, had you realized that this was going to progress to a genuine like shooting war? Or did you think that this was just like a flare up, and maybe things would go back to normal? Or what was your perspective on the ground?
Well, I really hoped that it wouldn't, because I'm sitting down there and I've worked in Panama. I mean, I'm always going to the Panamanian office buildings with the DENI, the Department of National Investigations. And then my wife, she works at Gorgeous Hospital. So this is not something that we were looking forward to. We did not want there to be an invasion. And we kept hoping that cooler heads would prevail and that things would not become more tense, but would calm down somewhat. But as I said, it just kept ratcheting up as the weeks and the months went by. There were more incidents where Americans were being harassed outside the base. And there was even one incident where the PDF stopped a number of school buses carrying U.S. children. And they said that the plates weren't properly registered. And that upset a lot of dependent wives and spouses that their kids were getting involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
So it really, everywhere you went, like when I first got down there, we would go out to restaurants in town, and we loved the Panamanian people. They were great folks, and they would whisper to you, "When are you going to get rid of this man? When are you going to do something?" Well, that was way above my pay grade. I didn't have anything to do with that. But they wanted him gone because they knew he was hurting the country. But after another year or so went by, we were hesitant to go out in town and patronize these establishments because you didn't know what would happen to you. You get pulled over by a PDF patrol car and get shaken down for money, or harassed or beaten or what have you. So after all of that started, my family, we spent a lot more time on base. We didn't go out in town very much.
Okay. Was it starting to feel like you were trapped a little bit, or were you just kind of hunkering down?
Oh, it was definitely a trap feeling because all of those bases, you had the Air Force base on the other side of the Panama Canal, and then Fort Clayton was about 5 miles down the road from Fort Amador, and then you had Albrook. So all of these bases were disconnected. So you had to drive through Panamanian territory to get to anywhere. So when you're in Panamanian territory, well, then you're subject to their traffic laws and their harassment. So it was pretty much the same feeling for everyone.
Okay, I see. And I understand that there was another young officer who was killed, and that was kind of the final catalyst, right? That really swung things toward decisive action.
Yeah, that was what caused Just Cause. Before we ever got to that, there were 2 coup attempts against General Noriega.
Oh, yeah.
There was one in March of 1988, and then there was another one, a larger one, that occurred on October the 3rd, 1989. And the October 3rd, 89 was when it really came home, literally speaking, for me. We heard gunfire from the office, and when we went up to the roof, you could see smoke from grenades and machine gun fire from Noriega's headquarters. See, our office was just across a small inlet of the Panama Bay from Noriega's commandancia. So I could, at any point, I could stand in my office and look out my office window and see his headquarters. Well, my government quarters was only 100 yards away. So, we could stand in the front window and see Noriega's headquarters from our house also. So everything was like really close together for myself and my family. But that morning, a Major Giraldi, took Noriega hostage and pleaded with him to step down. And he declined to turn Noriega over to U.S. authorities, and eventually lost his nerve and handed Noriega the pistol that he had pointed at him. Then that officer didn't see the day out. He was executed.
Wow.
So, but the rebels that had Noriega hostage, they were firing across this inlet toward Fort Amador because they didn't want 150 or so troops, Panamanian troops that were on Amador, a joint U.S. Panamanian base, to get involved. We were dispatched to the front gate to get a couple of agency personnel on board the station because everything was locked down. And while we were moving toward the front gate, I mean, you could hear bullets just snapping overhead. They were just firing randomly. And I looked at my house right there by the Fort Amador gate, and I went on the radio and I called my boss, Chuck Bryan. I said, "Chuck, I got to get Shelby, my baby, out of this house. She's only 2 years old." I said, "They're firing bullets." And then we started hearing RPGs explode out over the inlet. The Admiral happened to be monitoring our frequency, and he came up and he said, "I think it's best if you leave everybody where they're at right now." And Chuck came right behind the Admiral and said, "It's your child. You do what you think is best." So, yeah, Chuck Bryant, he became the best guy I ever worked for in my career when he said that.
Wow.
So I got the maid and my baby in a government car, pushed them down into the rear floorboard and drove them to a safer place, and then came back to my position. And later on that afternoon, the coup had failed. All of the coup plotters had been taken into custody. And I can remember sitting in my office with a window open, watching the Comandancia, and you'd hear these lone gunshots. And you realize that every time you heard a gunshot, somebody died. Somebody was being executed.
Mm-hmm.
And that proceeded all the way to after dark. That night, myself and Anya, we moved Shelby's crib into the middle part of the house because we were actually afraid of stray bullets coming from the city.
Mm-hmm.
So on October 3rd, when he survived that coup, I guess all of us down there knew that this thing was probably not going to end peacefully. We hated to see it. We dreaded what was going to be the impetus, to start it. But I think we all felt inside that it was not going to end peacefully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I can see, and I truly cannot imagine. I think the vast majority of Americans cannot imagine what it's like to experience small arms fire and maybe RPGs within earshot of your child, of your home. So, and just having to move a crib, to not get hit by stray bullets, that's hard to imagine on a military posting in what should have been peacetime. So, thank goodness everybody made it through that situation safely.
One of the things that the book, just because of, how the brevity that was required for the book, it really didn't do justice, were the clandestine source meets.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that we always had to meet our assets in Panamanian territory, which is essentially denied areas, and the danger involved in the meetings, because if they suspected that we were involved in intelligence activities or that our asset was involved, and they did a surveillance and caught us, we had no diplomatic immunity. We would have gone to prison for that. So we were working with the agency people because I learned quickly that they call the shots overseas, that anything you put out as far as a report, it has to be cleared through their office. And after a while, they provided us with some devices, concealment devices and water soluble paper, the paper that would dissolve if you dropped it in the water. And this is 35, 40-year-old spy stuff, but it was really helpful because I always carried a cup of coffee in a cup holder in my car, and I would take notes, and then and fold it up. So if we were like arrested, then I would drop it down into that hot water, the hot coffee, and it would totally dissolve.
Mm-hmm.
And we had our sources were backstopped. What's our cover story for meeting each other, and what did we talk about? So we always had a plan in the event that we were apprehended. But the book talked about the meets, but when I read the book finally myself, I realized there were so many meets. There was so much, that when you do a meet, you got to send your counter surveillance crew out there an hour before you roll up, because your counter surveillance guys have got to make sure that there's nobody loitering in the area and that nobody comes to the area, right before the meet starts.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're doing something like that, like one asset can keep the entire office busy, because you got to have, the most people we ever had during Just Cause, there were 5 agents. There was myself, Chuck Bryant, Ted Fay, Jim McDougal, and Mike Janekow. And Mike Janekow and Jim Dougal came down like pretty much when things had really started deteriorating. So when they hit the ground, they're the best people I ever worked with. They would help however they needed to help. They would go out and do those counter surveillances so that when I rolled up to meet the old man, I had a much better feeling that I had my guys out there that were watching my back and going to keep me from getting arrested.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, I think the one thing that the book wasn't able to present was how much time was being spent on these meets that we were doing.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. If it's it's an all office and like all day activity, maybe. And then I'm sure as you said, your reports were getting a lot of attention. So I guess that they had to be double checked and triple checked and written perfectly before you sent them out as well.
Yeah, but luckily when Chuck Bryant, he knew the intel side hands down. I would come in and I would have like 3 pages of everything that was discussed at the Comandancia. And based upon my background as a crim guy, I would have probably just written one report and put all of that in one report. But he knew, Chuck Bryant, his background was in FCI. Chuck knew that there were probably 8 or 10 different reports in that one meeting because a different division, we answered to 17 different intelligence agencies. So there were 17 agencies that after we put a report out could come back and ask us to follow up on the information or ask if there's any additional on that little tidbit.
Mm-hmm.
And Chuck Bryant, he knew where to get this to. So that made my job a lot better because I would come in and I would sit down with the guys and we would read the contents of the meeting, and then Chuck would, just like a quarterback, would say, okay, Rick, you take this, Ted, you take this, Mike, you take this. And everybody would break off and go back to their office and write up an intelligence report. So you can imagine that it didn't take long. We were commanding a lot of attention for the reporting that we were doing there.
Incredible stuff. Was there any attempt from back stateside or Naval Command anywhere to kind of micromanage you guys or take charge or have somebody else come in to meet with the old man, for example, or were they kind of just enable you as the guys on the ground?
There was an attempt early on between a couple of guys that were not there during Just Cause, that they were down there to work foreign counterintelligence, and they went in and complained to the special agent in charge that, why is this crim agent running this asset? We're supposed to be doing this work, and we should take him away from the crim guy. And I went to battle stations because I went out, I recruited the asset, I had the rapport with the asset. He didn't even like those 2 other guys. And basically I dug in and I said, look, I'm reporting everything he's given and I have the rapport with him and I'm going to continue working with him. The special agent in charge who was there at the time, he backed me up on that. I was able to keep him. Give you an idea about the time frame. There were no cell phones. It was before cell phones. We had pagers. So our assets would call our pager and then we would call them on a hardline phone. And that's how we would set up our meets. So you always had to give yourself an hour and a half before the actual meet time so that you could roll your counter surveillance and get out there. And like computers, they had some computers at headquarters but they were mainly, for the most part, the big desktop computers. And they wouldn't give me one because I was a crim guy. So I couldn't get one of these laptop computers because most of the guys at headquarters had all of them. So I was sent to the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for a 2-week total immersion Spanish course. And I did that. And I was thinking when I was at Pletsy that I need a better way to report this. So I went out to a Radio Shack and spent $1,800 buying a Tandy laptop computer that had a removable hard drive so I could take the disk out and lock them up in a safe at night. It was approved. I could do it, but I literally had to go spend $1,800 of 1987 money, which is a lot more.
Oh, yeah.
On a laptop that I was solely doing government work on. That's how committed that myself and those other agents were to what we were doing in the mission.
Wow, certainly sounds like that commitment paid off in the end. So I'm curious about, you never mentioned his name in the book, or they never mentioned his name in the book, but you just referred to him as the old man. Was he someone who was easy to work with? Like, did he need to be coddled, or did he, need to have his ego stroked or anything like that? Or like, how did the personal relationship develop?
Just in all of the above.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like I said, when I first met him, we had nothing in common. It was obvious. We had not a thing in common. But he hated Noriega. He knew that Noriega was pulling his country down. I, on the other hand, I didn't, Noriega, that wasn't my business. I didn't have a reason to be going after him. I was interested in protecting Navy and Marine Corps assets. Well, when Noriega started coming onto the tank farm, sending troops onto the tank farm, the relationship between myself and the old man became very symbiotic because we both had different goals in what we were doing, but Noriega himself, by his action, made us compatible and two friends that work well together.
Okay.
But yeah, this individual, he would get angry, and he would say, he said, "You're paper tigers. You write about things you're going to do, but you never do anything." Said, "You're all about writing reports and talking about it, but you're never going to take action." And he would give me information of where we could snatch Noriega, because by that time he was under indictment for the drug charges. And he wanted us to snatch him off the street and then fly him to the States. And I would explain to him that once again, that's above my pay grade. I don't make those decisions. And another thing about the old man too, I used to laugh with Chuck Bryant, my boss, about it. The old man insisted that I was the one in charge of everything. And I constantly told him, "Look, I'm just a worker. I'm just a guy who relays messages and who takes the information you have and runs it up the flagpole." I said, "I'm not the one in charge." And he never believed me. He always thought that I was the main guy. I'll tell you a story later on that really, really brought that home to roost. It was really funny, the outcome of that.
And you were fairly young then. You were what, like 28 or something like that, weren't you?
Yeah, I was 28 years old. And in fact, my wife looked at a picture of myself and Ted Fahey, my partner, and she said, "Why in the heck did anybody believe anything you said?" Said, "You guys look like you're in high school." But we were young special agents, and we were doing the job.
Yeah. You were right there in the right place at the right time, it sounds like, too. Dang.
That's the best way to put it.
So all of this, ultimately, it led to the invasion, right? Just cause. I mean, what was happening? Can you talk about the last couple of days or maybe even hours before things really kicked into high gear?
Yeah, Ted, he had to do some training in the States, and he was gone for like 4 months. And he gets back on a Friday night in December. It was like the 15th of December, 89. And as soon as he got back in the office, I went home and I watched on the news, and Noriega had given a speech and declared himself the maximum leader, chief executive officer of Panama. And he had already fraudulently stolen the election, the presidential election, and put his handpicked puppet in there. But here he is on television waving a machete and saying that we are in a state of war with the United States.
Wow.
And I just watched that. Well, then the next night, on Saturday night, the 16th, my wife, Anya, is doing dishes in the kitchen, and she's looking out the window. And you can see the comandancia, their Christmas lights on. And I'm entertaining my daughter in the other room, and she walks in with a dish towel in her hand. She said, "The lights in the comandancia just went out, just like somebody cut the switch off." And I thought, so I walked to the window and I looked, and the comandancia was completely black. And at that moment, the telephone rang, and it was the security department, and they told me that a Marine officer had been shot and killed by the PDF in Panama City. So that was on a Saturday evening, about 7, 8 o'clock at night. And so I got the guys, the agents. Chuck Bryant was in the States for Christmas, and he had been allowed to leave for a few days. So there was myself, Ted Fahey, Jim McDougall, and Mike Janekow. So you had 4 guys to do this death investigation. So I sent 2 of the guys to Gorgas Hospital to interview the occupants of the car and seize the death car and the evidence from the victim, Lieutenant Paz's body. And then a short while later, we found that a Navy SEAL officer and his wife had pulled up on this checkpoint right behind the car that was carrying Lieutenant Paz. And they watched the car speed away because the driver thought that they were going to be drug out of the car and beaten. So he sped off. Well, the Panamanian soldiers lowered their AK-47s and just opened up on the car. And one bullet struck Lieutenant Paz and fatally wounded him. So Ted and I went to the naval station when this Navy SEAL and his wife had been released from the PDF custody. And they told a harrowing story that he had been tied up and was beaten and just violently kicked in the groin and told that he was going to be killed. And his wife, she had only gotten in the country that day.
Oh my gosh.
Just arrived, and they had gone out for dinner in the city. They got her in a chair blindfolded, and they're telling her that they're going to sexually assault her and that they're going to rape her and saying all kind of vulgar things. And she was just terrified. So finally they released them and they came back to the naval station and reported. So we did those interviews because they were eyewitness to the murder. After we finished those interviews, we came back and Southern Command wanted the results of those interviews ASAP. So we typed up the results of the interviews and we went up to General Thurman's office at Southcom just as the sun was coming up. And I remember walking in, and we didn't get to talk to General Thurman himself, but a colonel walks out and he takes the 2 reports of those interviews. And he asked one question. He said, was there any indication that our guys were armed? And I said, no, Colonel, there wasn't. He said, thank you, you can go. So we turned to leave, and the Colonel says, gentlemen, you will never work on a more important investigation for the remainder of your career. So we had been up all night. There was still a lot of things to do, the processing of the evidence and more interviews and what have you. So we later learned that those interviews that we did were faxed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and that General Colin Powell took them over to the White House when they briefed President H.W. Bush. And so Bush, they said that the killing of the lieutenant disturbed them, but the way that the Curtises, the Navy SEAL and his wife were treated, got the whole room angry. So that's when they approved Operation Blue Spoon, which was later redesignated as Operation Just Cause.
Man, incredible to think what that poor woman and her husband went through, and that's like the main catalyst for everything that happened after that in some ways, or like the match that strikes the tinder, I guess you could say.
Well, it put on the center stage what Americans were having to endure.
Yeah.
And they had to endure this after they just killed a Marine officer. Mm-hmm. And so I think at that point, we pretty much knew that something was definitely going to happen. So we continued to work this murder investigation, and none of us got any sleep. We were just working around the clock because you can imagine the pressure that we were getting from Washington, D.C. All sorts of questions. NIS they wanted us to go out to the commandancia. This murder happened right by the commandancia. They wanted us to go out there and walk around and do a neighborhood canvass and ask for witnesses. And I would tell them, oh yeah, we'll get right on that. Yeah. I knew there was no way in hell we were going out there because we would have been taken prisoner had we gone out there. So on the morning of 19 December, Mike Janekow told me it was pretty early in the morning, and he was the son of Rear Admiral Gerald Janekow, who was the commander of U.S. Naval Forces Southern Command. And Mike walks up and he said, hey, Dad wants to see you right away. And I said, okay. And it's kind of curious because I'd already brief the Admiral on everything that we had to that point. So I went up the 2 flights of stairs to the 3rd floor where the Admiral's office was. And when he saw me, he got up and he walked over and told me to sit down on the couch. And then he closed and locked the door behind him. And he came over and sat right beside me on the couch, which was a bit odd too. And he leaned over and told me, he said, "What I'm about to tell you is top secret. You can't breathe a word to anyone. Do you understand?" And I nodded. I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Tonight, 1 o'clock in the morning, we're going to take out the Panama Defense Force." And I just sit there stunned. And I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "Put it this way." He said, "This time tomorrow, there won't be a PDF." So I was trying to catch my breath.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, I said, "Admiral, why are you telling me this?" And he said, "Your family is in our way." And I lived inside the gate at Fort Amador. The book says that I live outside the gate, but I lived in the 3rd house right by the only entrance and exit gate on Fort Amador. And he told me that I had to get my family moved because he knew that they could not guarantee the safety of any non-combatant in that area. So I had to come up with a story, and I couldn't tell the special agents in my office. So I went back downstairs and I realized that if we're overrun, we need to destroy some classified. And we had a procedure for destruction of classified material, emergency destruction. So we started doing that. I sent the office secretary with a $100 bill to stock up the refrigerator because I knew we might be there for days. And see, I couldn't tell a soul. And I had to engineer a way to get my wife and baby out of the house without telling them why I was taking them from the house. So I called Lieutenant Randy Clifton, still a good friend of mine. He was a naval officer at Rodman. I said, "Hey, Randy, let's do a cookout tonight." He said, "Okay." "Your house?" I said, "No, let's do it at your house." And he said, "Okay, 7 o'clock?" And I said, "No, let's do it at 5. So Randy's thinking, I just invited myself to his house for a cookout. And he was kind of quiet, but he, being the gentleman that he was, he didn't object. So I had to operate, the rest of the afternoon, and I was the only one who knew what was going to happen. At a briefing at 6 o'clock, 1800 that day, all of the officers in charge that answered Admiral Gineckow were called to a meeting, and he laid out the plan for what was going to happen at 1 o'clock in the morning. And I can remember so very well that Lieutenant Clifton was sitting at the conference room table in front of me. And when Admiral Gineckow said that we're going to take out the PDF at 1 o'clock in the morning, Randy just slowly turned and looked back at me like, "Oh, I understand why you're coming to a cookout now." So, and I was able to evacuate my wife and child, and even took the maid over to Clifton's house to make sure that they were out of harm's way.
Oh, wow. Just the tension is just ratcheting up for you, because even getting them immediately out of the harm's way, I mean, you're talking about a war starting in a few hours, and there's no way to get the wife and child out of harm's way, really.
Well, and another thing, see, all of these taskers involving the death investigation, I'm the criminal guy. Okay, I'm the guy that's supposed to be doing the death investigation. But on the same note, I'm running one of the most prolific intelligence assets in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm having to do both things at the same time. And Chuck Bryant calls from the States, and he said he's been ordered to return. Didn't know why, but he's been told to come back. And at the Pentagon, the Media Affairs Office had directed that I have the death card in front of the Treaty Affairs Office to allow the international press to photograph it. Well, that's the last thing I needed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if the Joint Chiefs tell you you're going to do that, you're not going to give them an excuse. So I remember we took the death car over, and all of the international press was let out there so they could take pictures. And there was an NBC News correspondent named Ed Rabel, and he just kept badgering the agents for questions about the investigation. And I can remember standing there looking over at Rabel's shoulder at the commandancia. And I was like, friend, you stand right here for a few more hours. You'll have all the story that you want. And then again, say I was the only one there that knew what was going to happen later on. And then I had to go meet the old man. When I went to meet the old man, the only thing that was on my mind as I was going to meet him was that he had a son that was assigned to the commandancia, who was working then at the commandancia. And I had to lie to him to his face. Now, this is a guy that he risked his life every day for us. He put his life on the line every day to provide information for us. And I knew that we were going to, U.S. warplanes were going to assault that building that night. And I couldn't tell him.
Mm-hmm.
That was a tough thing. That's one of the reasons that my wife and I, we just never really talked about Panama, was because of the personal relationships that we had with the people there. When the shooting started, you didn't really know who was going to make it when the smoke cleared. Mm-hmm. We could do. And we're sitting in the hallway in the floor, and Mike Zanecko said, "Hey Rick, it's 10 o'clock." And I said, "Okay, guys." I said, "It's going to start at 1 o'clock in the morning." I said, "I can't tell you what's going to happen, but it is going to be massive, and it's going to be loud, and it's going to be violent." And I said, break the Uzis and shotguns out, load all the magazines. I said, we're not combatants. We are in a defensive posture. And I said, but we're going to be right here in this office, because see, we didn't have cell phones. So the only thing that we could do was talk to our sources and relay information, hopefully to the command authority, if they had information that would potentially be valuable. So we were sitting there, and at about 12, we hear some vehicles fire up at the PDF buildings across the road, and there's a bus and a couple of sedans. And by the time they came in front of our office, they were firing machine guns out the window. Now, it's still 30 minutes before H hour, before the invasion time. So we didn't realize it because it was dark, but the paratroopers, the Army paratroopers, had taken the joint PDF guards at the gate down by my house. They had taken them prisoner and set up a 50 caliber machine gun aiming back up toward our office. When the PDF opened up going toward the gate, we opened up with a Browning 50 caliber machine gun. So the bus wrecked, there were several killed at that gate, and we were still 20 minutes or better from H hour. So everything just got strangely quiet. Nothing was happening. All of that gunfire, and then everything was silent. And I was looking out the window at the commandancia, and about that time, it just started exploding.
Oh my gosh.
And there was a C-130 Spectre gunship that started unloading a barrage of 105 howitzer and 20 millimeter cannon on top of it. So to best describe it, I've got photographs. I think you've got one in the book there, but it looked like a fireworks display going off on the ground, like a fireworks display went wrong. It was just a series of constant explosions. And that's when the Delta operators flew on to Carcel Modelo, which was across the street from all of this bombardment going on. And they were able to rescue Kurt Muse from the prison that was right across the street from the commandancia.
My gosh. Yeah, I did a whole episode about Kurt Muse with his daughter, Kimberly. It was over a year ago now, but that's a incredible story. It's covered in the book as well, but I know that was like totally separate from what you were doing. Were you aware? I mean, I guess you were well aware of Kurt Muse, but you didn't have any interaction with him before or during or anything like that?
No, there was never a time that I met Kurt Muse.
Okay.
Whatever he was doing, and for whatever reason, I wasn't privy to. And when he got captured, and we knew that he was in captivity over there. There's not a night that I didn't go home to my quarters and look across that inlet at that prison and just think that of him being there and how I did not want to wind up over there with him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, fortunately, that story has a pretty happy ending to it. He made it out alive. It was very, very harrowing, of course, but I'm glad that rescue worked out as well as it did.
It's actually an incredible story.
Truly.
I think it was Delta's first rescue of a hostage, and a lot of the Delta guys got banged up. Kurt Hughes luckily didn't have much injury, but it was an incredible story of the Delta operators.
Yep, no doubt about it. So you mentioned that your office, you guys were in a defensive posture. Did you remain at your office throughout the fighting, or did you have to leave at any point?
It got so loud that when the General Steiner, when he found out that there was hostilities at Amador, he moved H hour up, and it started officially 15 minutes before it was scheduled to. So, and when all of the gunfire started, you could hear gunship helicopters screaming above the office. They were strafing the Comandancia, and you could hear, 50 caliber machine guns were just everywhere and firing in amongst concrete buildings at night. If you could imagine what that sounds like.
Wow. Yeah.
And then we started hearing thumps and thuds, and we realized that those were bullets that were hitting the building, hitting the walls. And then you would hear glass tinkle and like a pop, pop, pop. And that was bullets that came through a window and were bouncing off the walls inside. We had several rounds that had come into the office, and it went on all night long. The battle for Amador right there, I think it was the first of the 508th and paratroopers. It went on basically all night, and they didn't assault the PDF compound or the PDF buildings across the road until well after daylight the next morning. And Chuck Bryant, my boss, special agent in charge, he was able to get home to his quarters just minutes before the shooting started. He flew back from Woodbridge, Virginia, and got in his quarters just minutes before the shooting started. So he had to basically hunker down there until some Army Rangers were able to move him to the office at daylight.
My gosh, what a homecoming! So did all of you guys made it out okay? Like your team, everybody was fine by the time the hostilities ended?
Yeah, we were worried. We were worried more about assets than anybody else because there was nothing you could do if they moved or they got it. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Then they could have lost their lives just like anyone else.
Sure.
And like I said, the invasion went on all night long. And even in the next morning, the Army had Sheridan tanks that were moving in the Chorrillo area, firing, trying to take out the last elements of the PDF that were fighting. I mean, I wasn't really surprised. I kind of knew that those guys were full of piss and vinegar and that they would fight. And they did. A lot of them did fight to the bitter end.
My gosh.
So
how long exactly did fighting last? Was it like 2 days or less than that?
Yeah, it was a couple of days. I would say that within 18 hours, most of the fighting where we were located was concluded. And there was an Army general, Cisneros, fluent Spanish speaker, and he was able to call the garrisons that were up in the interior and tell them, or basically plead with them and say, you can see what's happening at the Comandancia. It's going to happen to you unless you put down your weapons and walk out with your hands up. So I would credit him to saving a lot of lives on both sides because he was able to use the telephone and encourage those guys to not resist because it would have been futile.
Yeah, that's good. I know it was, we don't want it to end up in a total catastrophe for the Panamanian people. And, after so many years of, close allyship and all that, and just letting, General Noriega ruin relationship between the two countries for so long.
Yeah.
So what did you do in the aftermath of all of this once the fighting was over with? I guess you had a job to do once again, right?
Well, after the hostilities were over with, Noriega fled to the Vatican embassy of the papal nuncio. So they had him surrounded there, and the army science people were blaring rock music so he couldn't sleep. And I looked at who he was with out there at the papal nuncio, and three of the people that were in there, I had met and I had known from different events during the 4 years I had been there. So that's, going back on the clandestine meets, because I was a criminal investigator, I always attended every event that we were invited to by the Panamanians because I wanted them to know me as a criminal investigator. And that if they saw me somewhere, that they would recognize me as, oh, he's the Navy criminal guy.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't think two things about it.
Okay. Yeah, understandable. Very understandable. So I understand from the book that you kind of I don't know if I'd say stumbled across, you found a lot of evidence of Noriega's involvement with witchcraft and like black magic kind of stuff after you entered the commandancia. Is that correct?
Well, no, that was it. He had an office at Fort Amador.
Oh, okay.
Building 8 at Fort Amador. And there was a lot there, but one of the CIA guys had called Ted, and he needed Ted to go to Noriega's office to go through that for a document exploitation run. And I really wanted to go, but because I was the crim guy, Chuck Bryant had been notified that there was a witch house on the Amador Causeway, and and they thought they found drugs there. So the crim guy, got to go to the witch house. The Army had it, so they had it cordoned off. So I was the one that went in. That was where the Brazilian witches were being housed.
Mm.
And when I got there, the Army, the guys I talked to were kind of creeped out. And I understood why when I went in, because there was this coffee table with this big fish, and it had these needles, like 8 or 10 needles impaling the fish. And there were candles that were still lit everywhere, and their purses and wallets were there. And I checked their IDs, and I could not understand how there's one way in and one way out of Amador, and their purses and wallets are still there, and candles are still lit, but there's no people there. And so there were obvious signs that he was involved in those rituals, and there were other things at his office that indicated his belief in the Santeria type rituals. And another thing too, the source told me, my asset told me, that he tried to wrap himself in all religions because he thought that if he subscribed to all religions, it would make him invincible. And there was one incident where he had the witches there, and they killed some chickens and drained the chickens of their blood, and Noriega stripped naked, and they covered him in his chicken blood, and they were, dancing around him and doing these spells that he thought was going to give him invincibility.
Oh, wow.
So, but the asset got so sickened by that he couldn't stay. He actually walked out of the room and left. So Noriega was definitely into the black magic and the voodoo stuff.
Man, that's interesting. And on top of that, all the other religious practices, I guess he ascribed to this, taking out multiple insurance policies, I suppose.
Exactly. Oh. He thought it would protect him.
Dang. So after all of this ends, I mean, things are vastly different in Panama, I assume. Did you continue for the remainder of a set tour after that, or was that like the end of your time in Panama?
When the shooting had concluded and I was able to bring my wife and daughter back to Fort Amador, we didn't know if this thing was going to continue as a guerrilla war, and that it would be very dangerous for travel anywhere. So Anya was 5 months pregnant, and she was getting close to that point where she couldn't fly anymore, that they would not permit her to fly on a military plane. So I made arrangements to fly her to my parents' house in Huntsville, Alabama, and leave her and Shelby there, and I would return to Panama and complete my tour. I still had 6 months before I would be allowed to leave. So we flew out on a military plane to the States, and I can remember that when we got to Miami, there were a couple of people that asked us, oh, you came from Panama, and they realized what had happened. But when we got to Alabama, it was like life is totally normal. Nobody asked any questions. Nobody said, what happened down there. It was just, oh, good, you're home. And so Anya, was basically, staying with my folks with my daughter, and I was back in Panama, working, unaccompanied for 6 months. So when I got back, that's when the interrogations were taking place, because all of the officers, um, they we had to interrogate them. They were prisoners of war. So there was no question at that point about, what we were involved with, because by that point they were all prisoners. And another thing, you had to stand up a new government. So there was a black, white, and gray list. And you would, if there was somebody that you really liked, that you thought was squared away and could be a part of the new government, then you'd put them on the white list. And, if you knew the guy was a bad guy, that would you blacklist him. And the gray is like, I don't know one way or another. So I remember one guy that had been very helpful to me when I would go to the commandancia, and I put him on the white list. And I got called over to the agency office one day and says, "Hey, we got to talk about this guy." And I bowed up. I'm like, no, you need to make him a part of the government. I said, he's the only guy that would really help me at the commandancia. And the agency guy looked at me and he said, "Rick, how much do you think he makes a year?" And that caught me off guard. I said, well, probably 30,000 in his rank. And he said, how would you explain the $2 million he has in an account? And I just, and the guy looked at me like, "Okay, Rick, you can close your mouth now. Mm-hmm. He's not going to be on the white list." Mm. So I had read that guy wrong. He was apparently taking cartel money too.
Oh man.
So, but then, when we owned the country, then we had to provide law enforcement, and you had a lot of those former Panamanian troops that we had been fighting against, or the military had been fighting against. They had to become a part of the new government and pick up shotguns and pistols and go back out there on the streets and do a police function. Hmm. So there was never a time that you weren't like working with the Panamanians. And in fact, once the invasion took place, we were actually more hands-on in working with them, because we were trying to get them to do the job to protect their own citizenry. So it was challenging, because even then we were doing things that we really weren't trained to do, but they had to be done, and the job fell on us to try to coordinate some of those things. Hmm. And I told you earlier that there was a time that the old man, he always thought I was the one that was in charge of the office. In spite of every time he said that, I would explain to him that I wasn't. Well, there was a Saturday morning, and the U.S. ambassador to Panama had an appointment to see Admiral Janekow in his office. So Chuck Bryant comes in and he said, "Hey, I've got a meeting. I've got a conflict." But said the ambassador wants to stick his head in our office and just say hello. Can you handle this? And Chuck, I don't want to do that. Get somebody else. And he goes, "No, you're my ASAC. I'm not going to be there. You're going to do it." I said, "Okay." So I was standing in the hallway when the U.S. ambassador came out from his meeting with the admiral. We walked down to the office, and we were standing just talking at my desk for probably 15 minutes. And he said, "Well, I've got to go. Thank you for seeing me in your office." So we walk out, and here's the ambassador's limousine sitting in front of the red carpet in front of our building under the awning. And I'm walking out with the U.S. ambassador, going down the steps, and shake his hand as he gets into the car. Well, guess who's walking up the sidewalk? The old man. And he looks, and the picture to him says that the U.S. ambassador came to see me, because the ambassador is leaving my office. So from that point forward, I could never convince him that I wasn't in charge of anything. He just rolled his head. I said, look, I tried to explain to him what happened. He says, no, you're in charge. I know you're in charge. So, but it was different after the invasion because all of the OPSEC that we had to practice before just to not get captured. Well, then there wasn't a bad guy. We had taken the country down. So the old man, felt comfortable to walk onto Amador and walk up to my office.
Wow. Incredible changes there from start to finish. Just an unforgettable tour, clearly.
It was an incredible 4 years from reading on the plane that we had accused Noriega of trafficking narcotics to where it all ended up. It was an incredible 4 years.
Oh, yeah, certainly was. So what did you do after that? I know you had quite a bit of time left in NIS or NCIS after that, right?
Yeah, I was just a young guy. So they gave us our choice of duty stations. I went back to the office in Millington, Tennessee, and I was the assistant special agent in charge at that office. And I wanted as far away from counterintelligence as I could get. And I didn't want to do that anymore. So I worked criminal cases. And I did that until the USS Cole got bombed in Yemen. And I was sent TDY to Bahrain. And from that point, after the Cole was bombed, 9/11 happened. And I got designated as a counterterrorism agent and was loaned to the FBI for 4 years and was on the Joint Terrorism Task Force on an international terrorism squad. So I reported to work every day at the FBI for 4 years, and then I was transferred back to Bahrain for a 1-year unaccompanied tour. And I did the year there on the threat mitigation unit, working outside the base operation to make sure there was no surveillance on the naval facility. And then I had my time in. I left Bahrain and came home and retired.
Thanks. So a lot of memorable experiences. Panama wasn't just the only thing that happened for you.
Oh, no, the Middle East was also very memorable.
I bet.
And working the Joint Terrorism Task Force, it was a great group of guys. It was really everybody took, the best people they had and loaned them to this task force to work counterterrorism.
Wow. So what do you do now that you're retired?
When I retired, the reason I retired when my dad was sick. And we've got 350 acres of cattle land here between Nashville and Huntsville. So he couldn't take care of the farm anymore. And since I could retire, my mom needed me to help her. So I came to the farm. I retired in 2008 and came to the farm, and I've been raising Black Angus cows ever since.
Wow. Quite a change, but it sounds pretty peaceful.
It's much more peaceful because I don't get near the feedback or the consternation from these cows that I did from people.
I'll bet. Well, fascinating. Well, Rick, you've got an incredible story. I'm so glad that you shared it with me. I'm so happy that we were able to connect as we did. For the listeners out there, if you want to read the book, Rick is not the author, but he is the primary subject. It's called Ghosts of Panama by Mark Harmon and Leon Carroll Jr., and it's available now. It's been out since November, so you can read a lot more about the entire situation in Panama, about his coworkers and his family and everything. Just an incredible story, as you can clearly tell. So, Rick, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And normally I ask my guests to share like a website or a social media profile with the listeners, but I understand that you don't have any of that at all, do you?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay, you're not missing out on too much. I can promise you that. Well,
guaranteed.
Yep. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We'll definitely stay in touch, okay?
Thank you very much.
Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.